Subcommittee will come to order without objection. The chair is authorized to declare recess at any time. Without objection, the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Tiffany, will be allowed to participate in today's hearing. We welcome everyone to today's hearing on the regulatory barriers to entry and competition in meat processing. I anticipate this will be a very bipartisan committee hearing, and so I want to begin with a quotation from President Biden's State of the Union in 2022. He's very aware of the problem that we're trying to address here today. He said in his State of the Union, when corporations don't have to compete, their profits go up and your prices go up when they don't have to compete. Small businesses and family farmers and ranchers, I need not tell some of my Republican friends from those states, guess what? You got 4 basic meat packing facilities, that's it. You play with them or you don't get to play at all. And you pay a hell of a lot more because there's only 4. So that's from our President, Joe Biden. Just a housekeeping thing to begin with. I'm gonna keep the members to 5 minutes as much as I can with the gavel, but if in 5 seconds you ask an existential question to a witness and they need more than 4 seconds to respond, we will let the witness finish their answer. So I know we're famous for doing that. And I will now recognize myself for an opening statement. In today's hearing, we will explore how various laws create barriers to entry and expansion in the meat processing industry. Federal laws concerning meat processing needlessly undercut federalism by requiring that state-enforced requirements are at least equal to federal requirements. These one-size-fits-all regulatory barriers entrench the largest meat processors and prevent small, independent processors from competing effectively. Allowing states to set their own regulatory standards means that small processors would likely flourish and would be able to better serve ranchers and farmers and the consumers who want to buy the food from them. During COVID, we saw the results of having only a few large facilities and not enough functioning small facilities. Large facilities with employees in close quarters struggled through the outbreaks and at times slowed or even stopped operations. Some farmers and ranchers were forced to take extreme and costly measures such as euthanizing livestock. And for farmers who care about their animals, and most farmers do, this was a terrible situation to be in, to euthanize livestock instead of to have them go serve as nutrition for consumers. Consumers saw meat become less affordable if they could find it in the grocery store shelves. Removing artificial and unnecessary restrictions and regulations will help encourage more small-scale processing, and increasing the number of small-scale processors will help counteract disruptions in the supply chain. It's important to note that deregulation will not result in compromised food safety. State and local health agencies will inspect independent processors to ensure they are meeting safety standards. Small custom slaughterhouses have been operating safely for decades. We're going to hear from some of the owners of these small slaughterhouses. Federal and legislative regulatory reform would benefit farmers and ranchers and allow a broader variety of local, safe, and humane meat to reach the American people. There's bipartisan agreement about some of the problems in the meat packing industry. Just 4 companies account for over 80% of beef processed in the United States. Similarly, 4 companies process approximately 70% of hogs. Of these companies that I've mentioned, 1 is owned by China, 1 is owned by Brazil. And these companies process most of the meat in just a few massive facilities. Less than 10% of the facilities in the United States process over 95% of all cattle. And less than 5% of facilities in the U.S. process over 90% of all hogs. There's also bipartisan agreement about some of the solutions. The Bipartisan Processing Revival and Interstate Meat Exemption Act, or PRIME Act, is one of the proposals that would increase competition and enhance consumer choice. Today, we have the opportunity to hear from our witnesses about their real-world experiences, their work in the meat industry, and the difficulties they face. A better understanding of these issues will aid us as we work to make impactful change and find solutions that benefit processors, ranchers, farmers, and consumers. I now recognize the chairman of the full committee, or the ranking member, sorry, I almost gave him a promotion that Mr. Jordan would not approve of. Okay. I now recognize the ranking member of the full committee for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, as we examine barriers to entry and competition in the meat processing industry, we should focus our attention on the key barrier to entry: massive consolidation and concentration of power in just a handful of companies. Consolidation in the meat processing industry is an issue that has plagued our country for over 100 years. In the late 1890s, our meat marketplace was dominated by just a handful of stockyards and packers. This dominance led to the passage of the Sherman Antitrust Act in 1890. In the years following, Congress doubled down on its commitment to protect the market from dominant firms' abuse by passing the Clayton Antitrust Act, the Federal Trade Commission Act, and the Packers and Stockyards Act. Meanwhile, the publication of Upton Sinclair's The Jungle in 1906 brought public attention to the deplorable conditions that workers in the meat processing industry were facing and the poor sanitary standards employed by the 5 dominant meat processing firms. Rising to meet these concerns, Congress passed the nation's foundational consumer protection laws in this area, the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Federal Meat Inspection Act. We face similar concerns today about market concentration in the meat processing industry as our predecessors faced at the turn of the last century. Then there were 5 firms that dominated the market. Now we have only 4. Although on balance, our food is safer and standards for workers are higher, meat processing is less competitive and more concentrated than it was in the 1900s, leading to a range of harms for small business, consumers, and workers. Today, 85% of all beef processing, 70% of all pork processing, and 54% of all chicken processing is controlled by 4 companies: Tyson, JBS, Marfrig, and Seaboard. By relying on these big 4 companies for our meat production, we have allowed our food system to become highly fragile and beset with bottlenecks. As the COVID-19 pandemic showed us, our current food system can easily be disrupted. This rise in dominance has resulted in lower operating costs for the large meat plants, but these lower costs have not been passed on to consumers, have not resulted in higher wages for workers, and have not led to increased profit for farmers. Rather, these large companies exploit their dominant position as middlemen to extract high profits and pad their own bottom lines. In the face of these concerns, we must consider ways to roll back the mergers that created this consolidation, explore methods of supporting smaller meat processors, and increase oversight where possible to rein in abusive and deceptive practices. What we should not do is consider rolling back meat inspection requirements that keep our food safe. Doing so would not help create more competition in the market, but instead would result in the commercial sale of meat that does not meet minimum federal safety standards. Currently, meat sold commercially in the U.S. must either be processed at a federally inspected facility or at a state-inspected facility that enters into a cooperative agreement with the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Food and Safety Inspection Service. 27 states allow processors to operate under a cooperative agreement. Under this arrangement, facilities must enforce requirements, quote, at least equal, close quote, to those imposed by the federal government under federal law. Unless these states opt into an additional program with the USDA, they can only sell their meat within the state. Whether the meat is processed in a federally inspected facility or one of the state-run facilities under a cooperative agreement with the USDA, inspectors continuously conduct oversight of the facility to ensure the safety and quality of meat and the health and wellness of livestock. These inspections not only ensure that our meat is safe for consumption, but also that any health issues that do arise with the processed meat can be traced back to the facility that produced it. By contrast, facilities that are not operated under either program, also known as custom slaughterhouses or processing plants, are only inspected periodically. For this reason, they are only eligible for personal, household, guest, and employee use. Proposals to weaken the system by allowing custom slaughterhouses to serve commercial customers would inject far too much risk into our food safety system without addressing the root problem that is holding back competition in the meat processing industry. Instead, we must find solutions that will support the entry of smaller meat processors into the market and ways of leveling the meat processing market generally to encourage more competition and more choices for suppliers, buyers, and processors while maintaining strict safety standards. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses, and I yield back the balance of my time.
I thank the ranking member of the full committee, and now I recognize the chairman of the full committee, Mr. Jordan, for a comment.
I thank the chairman. I'll be brief. I just wanted to thank you, Chairman, and the staff for putting this important hearing together, and I look forward to hearing from our panel. Thank you.
Without objection, all other opening statements will be included in the record. We will now introduce today's witnesses. Mr. Joel Salatin and his family own Polyface Farm in Virginia's Shenandoah Valley. He also co-owns Honest Meats, LLC, a small federally inspected meat producer in Harrisonburg, Virginia. His farm produces beef, pork, poultry, and other products, selling to roughly 10,000 families through an online farm store, nationwide direct shipping, on-farm store, nationwide direct shipping, and urban drop points. It also services boutique retail markets and some institutional food services. Ms. Rosanna Baum is a co-owner and general manager of Bauman's Cedar Valley Farm in Anderson County, Kansas. Bauman and her family operate a farm growing non-GMO crops and raising cattle, sheep, and poultry, as well as a poultry processing facility, a butcher store, a farm feed business, a custom agricultural services business, and a pet food business. In addition to on-farm sales and their butcher store, Bauman's Farm sells their meat and poultry at farmers markets. Mr. Joe Trotter is director of the Energy, Environment, and Agriculture Task Force at the American Legislative Exchange Council. Prior to joining ALEC, he was a congressional staffer and worked for free market organizations and campaigns. He is an avid outdoorsman and a conservationist and spent 2 years on the board of governors at the Bethesda Chevy Chase Isaac Walton League, a local nonprofit organization that maintains a 624-acre conservation farm. Mr. Greg Gunthorpe and his family own and operate a pasture-based livestock operation in Northeast Indiana. Their operation includes an on-farm USDA-inspected slaughter and processing plant. His farm provides pork, poultry, and lamb to restaurants in Chicago, Indianapolis, and the surrounding region. He is a past board member of the American Pastured Poultry Producers Association. We welcome our witnesses and thank them for appearing today. I also want to thank the folks in the crowd who came here to witness the witnesses. And I'm going to begin by swearing you in, just the witnesses, not the observers. Would you please rise and raise your right hand? Do you swear or affirm under penalty of perjury that the testimony you're about to give is true and correct to the best of your knowledge, information, and belief, so help you God? Let the record reflect that the witnesses have answered in the affirmative. Thank you, and please be seated. Please know that your written testimony will be entered into the record in its entirety. Accordingly, we ask that you summarize your testimony in 5 minutes. Mr. Salatin, you may begin. And make sure your microphone is on. Press the button.
Is it on?
Yes. Now, Mr. Salatin, you may begin.
Good. Thank you. Right now, nationwide, a farmer wanting to get a slaughter slot in a small federal inspected meat processing plant often must book 6 months to a year in advance. For pork, that's before the piggy is even born. It's never been like this. What happened? In short, regulatory extortion tyranny. Inspection regulations are size prejudicial. I know one facility that was ordered closed because it wasn't processing fast enough. The Food Safety Inspection Service measures its efficiency by pounds inspected per personnel hour, creating an adversarial discriminatory attitude towards small plants. In 1906, when Upton Sinclair wrote The Jungle, 7 large companies controlled half the nation's meat processing capacity. After a century of government intervention, 4 now control almost 85%. When licenses and compliance make entering and maintaining an abattoir more burdensome to small facilities than large, concentration and centralization is not an antitrust issue. It's discriminatory regulatory issue. It's a perfect example of mission creep. What started sincerely as a food safety objective morphed into regulatory overburdensome harassment. A small plant operator dare not object to subjective and political inspector decisions because poke and sniff allows retribution toward folks with questions. Entrepreneurs are enslaved and held hostage by bureaucrats who share no business risk and rule without restraint. Meanwhile, more Americans desire a more localized, stable, secure, transparent, nutrient-dense, relational, trustworthy food supply than centralized industrial facilities offer. We have eager and willing buyers, farmers desperate to direct market to their neighbors, but a bureaucracy that stands in the way of voluntary consenting adults exercising freedom of choice for their body's microbiome fuel. Few human decisions speak to freedom like what we have the right to swallow. I can butcher a beef in the field, process it, and give it away, but if I sell an ounce, I'm a criminal. What is it about exchanging money that suddenly makes meat unsafe? Clearly, current market regulations are not about safety, they are about market access. Our society recognizes scale and relationship when assessing risk. In Virginia, we can keep 3 daycare children in our private home without a license and governmental oversight. Why? Because an entity, an arrangement that small inherently offers seller-buyer intimacy that vets itself equal to licenses and inspectors. In Virginia, we can keep 3 elder care patients in our private home without licenses and government oversight. Why? Because such an intimate arrangement protects equal to the government. Expectations and trust provide context in any transaction. People who want to disentangle from the agri-industrial government crony complex don't expect their provenance to be squeezed through the regulatory process. They trust their farmer more than a government agent. While this group, both farmer and customer, may represent a lunatic fringe of the society, we all know that's where innovation comes from. And how society deals with its unorthodox element defines its march toward tyranny or freedom. Our society, desperate for food security and stability, wallows in a morass of regulatory impediments to what we need and desire. Well, what remedies exist? Right now, 1968's Public Law 90-492, known as the producer-grower exemption, allows 20,000 head of poultry to be processed on farm without inspection. This has enabled thousands of community-scaled neighbor-to-neighbor entrepreneurs to launch small broiler operations. To my knowledge, not a single customer has been harmed by this exemption. Why not extend it to beef or to pork? Right now, custom processing designation allows me to sell pre-slaughter portions of an animal, usually in wholes, halves, and quarters. Well, why limit my customers to large volumes? Let them buy by the cut. Congressman Thomas Massey's Prime Act would enable this. Another remedy could simply be a food emancipation proclamation, allowing farmers currently enslaved by regulatory shackles to sell meat to neighbors. Right now, farmers can give it away, they just can't sell it. Neighbors can buy and feed it to their children. Clearly, if uninspected meat is hazardous, the commerce prohibition should be on the buyer as well as the seller, but it's not, which clearly illustrates the prohibition's hypocrisy. Surely, if we really want freedom of food choice and food security, we can create a remedy that refuses to criminalize neighborly meat transactions. The only reason food freedom was not written into our Bill of Rights was because our nation's founders could not have imagined a time when neighbors could not exchange a chuck roast or sausage. At some point, requiring professional league infrastructure and referees on a sandlot pickup ball game is both inappropriate and malicious. It's time to remove the heavy hand of tyranny from America's food system by allowing market access, opportunity, and competition for producers and consumers seeking freedom of food choice. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Salatin. Ms. Baumann, you may begin your testimony.
Okay, oops.
Got it. You're good.
Okay, is this going now? Maybe my. All right, thank you for inviting me here. It's rare that I get to talk about butchery because usually that's like a conversation killer. Especially if you're on airplanes. So a year ago, I probably wouldn't have been a good candidate. I do poultry processing. I agreed to speak here because I figured it would be good therapy for me, actually. I had an incident last summer after 15 years of operating USDA-inspected poultry and beef plants that really helped bring to light some of the flaws in the inspection system, I guess. And it took me 90 days to get my voice heard. And my business lost a significant amount of money in the meantime. In short, it's a very long story, but in short, we had a small mechanical failure that opened the door to a overly aggressive FSIS supervisor who come in and placed all of my 3,000 chickens on hold, wouldn't review basically any of my corrective actions. It's a situation that if it happened in a large plant, it could be resolved in a matter of hours. It took me 90 days to resolve this. My business lost $80,000. All 3,000 of those birds were condemned. My process was not complete without a personal farm visit from the head of the Food Safety Inspection Service, the administrator there. In the end, all of those 3,000 birds got the wholesome stamp of inspection from the USDA, and they all went back to their farmers. A lot of layers in there, but the concern and the takeaway that I got from that experience was I was a 15-year-old plant. They're all over. We have the USDA. It's one of their priorities. We've all seen it. We do have a nice increase of new plants. We do have a lot of attractive grants that are being dangled for folks to move towards USDA inspection. If I was a baby businesswoman and had the same experience, I would have folded. And in fact, last summer, that was a very stressful time for us in the business, and I had to take a step back and, ask myself, why in the world am I doing this? Why am I a butcher at all? And it was like a Queen Esther moment for me because I didn't need the inspection services for my own farm stability, for my own markets, for any of my own thing, but my community did. I processed for a lot of other farmers, and I had survivor's guilt. I could, reduce my stress, but they needed that inspection service to access their markets. And if that would have occurred to me younger in my inspection journey, I would have been yet another plant closure. And during this process, I've talked to a lot of other plants around the nation that's ran into similar problems, not knowing how to navigate the entire inspection system. And I found out the hard way that the Food Safety Inspection Service is set up completely contrary to the American judicial system, and to where we are presumed guilty first. Even worse, so my product was consumed or presumed contaminated with no evidence of contamination. And even worse, my judge and jury was also the same as my accusers. So nothing that I did or said would have to be considered. The USDA FSIS does not have an ombudsman, unlike a lot of federal agencies. I don't believe that an ombudsman would be very helpful. We need like a mediation board. The other thing that the USDA has a overreach of purpose with the Food Safety Inspection Service. They're there to inspect food safety, not public health, and they're there to inspect food as it moves about within commerce. That's not the direct-to-consumer markets at all. That really helps clarify, I think, the purpose and a lot of where we bump into our, against things that feel like overburdensome regulations are sometimes just simply an entire misapplication of them, trying to apply them where they don't belong at all. Barriers to entry, specific beyond just regulations, also include labor and waste management. That's inclusive of access to labor and with the waste management that's how Tyson makes their money, that's how the small plants used to make their money. Those value streams have disappeared. The labor access, the same way. If we're going to open up, stay operating, those things need to happen. But do appreciate you guys coming or inviting me here, and come on out anytime to our butcher shops. We'll put you to work.
Thank you, Ms. Baumann. Mr. Trotter, You may begin your opening statement.
Good morning, and thank you for the invitation to testify before the committee. I'm Joe Trotter, Director of ALEC's Energy, Environment, and Agriculture Task Force, and I look forward to bringing our nonpartisan analysis to this. ALEC is America's largest nonpartisan voluntary membership organization of state legislators dedicated to the principles of limited government, free markets, and federalism. Our members represent more than 60 million Americans and provide jobs for 30 million people across the country. The issue at hand cuts to the very core of ALEC's principles of encouraging free, competitive markets and balancing state and federal authority. A little over 50 years ago, Congress passed the Wholesome Meat Act, prohibiting states from setting their own inspection rules on slaughterhouses and meat processing facilities. Congress also prohibited the intrastate sale of meat from cattle, sheep, swine, and goats unless it was processed at a facility with an on-site inspector subject to federal regulations. Today, local farmers that are looking to serve their communities by supplying grocery stores or farm-to-table restaurants face essentially the same statutory and regulatory burdens applied to multinational, vertically integrated corporate conglomerates. It often means that local farmers engaging in traditional commerce truck their cows and pigs to the same slaughterhouses and processing facilities as major animal agriculture producers, which can be hundreds of miles away. Thousands of meat processing facilities shuttered their operations over the last 4 decades, leaving farmers and ranchers with significantly less options for slaughtering and processing their meat. As it currently stands, less than 100 slaughterhouses are responsible for over 95% of the country's meat production. As a result of the laws and regulations governing who can process meat for commercial consumption, there are high barriers to entry for small businesses looking to increase their market capacity. Facilities staffed by FSIS and state inspectors usually operate at full capacity, meaning farmers and ranchers have fewer choices on where to have their animals slaughtered and processed. While the supply of processing facilities contracted, the demand for meat products throughout the country surged, creating an even higher demand for the processing facilities. Farmers are increasingly forced to book appointments months in advance and often have to travel over state lines. Centralization also leaves the meat supply chain and, by extension, the country's food security vulnerable to massive disruption. When a large plant shutters its operations, the capacity within the market to pick up the slack largely does not exist, causing meat prices to skyrocket. Unfortunately, we saw this play out to a degree during the COVID-19 pandemic and in other instances when plants were forced to halt their operations due to, say, fire or flood. Similarly, when things go wrong with these large centralized processing facilities, the impacts on the immediate supply chain are enormous. With 85% of grain-fed cattle processed by the 4 largest producers, if one plant has an outbreak of a foodborne pathogen that forces a recall, there is a massive, immediate economic impact on food pricing and availability. When these recalls happen from the largest processing facilities, millions of pounds of meat are pulled off the shelves and ultimately destroyed. Now, there are other options to decentralize the production, but they can't currently bring their products to market because of federal law and regulation. Custom slaughterhouses exist all throughout the United States, but by statute, they are only allowed to slaughter meat for personal consumption. With over 1,000 of these facilities all across the country, they are well positioned to provide the option of locally sourced meat to their communities. Now, custom slaughterhouses are required to follow all USDA and as well as state law and regulation, but they don't have on-site inspectors. Instead of having a persistent inspector presence, they are examined by federal, state, and local authorities throughout the year. With legislative updates to the Federal Meat Inspection Act, states could, if they wish, they're not required to, allow customs slaughterhouses and processing businesses to sell meat commercially. This would empower small businesses, including ranchers, farmers, processors, restaurants, local grocers, while also ensuring food security on a state and local level. Farmers and ranchers who just want to serve their local restaurants and grocers should not be forced to compete for the same space in slaughterhouses with the multinational corporations. They are ready and willing to be inspected up to standards. This is a perfect example of well-meaning federal regulation run amok. There is an opportunity to empower small businesses, decrease regulation, and improve food security if Congress decides to act. Thank you for the opportunity to speak.
Thank you, Mr. Trotter. Mr. Gunthorpe, you're recognized now for your opening statement.
I'm Greg Gunthorpe, an artisan farmer, processor, and meat distributor. I'm a member of the American Grass-Fed Association and Farm Action. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the opportunity to present today. I grew up on a diversified family farm in the 1970s and 80s. After attending the land-grant university, I came home to farm with my family. In 1994, the hog market dipped, and Dad said the hog industry was over for the independent hog farmer. My wife and I bought the sow herd and went off on our own. We found out in 1998, Dad was right. The market crashed. We sold live pigs for less than what my grandpa sold them for in the Depression. After selling pigs in the commodity market for 4 generations, we sold our first dressed pig to a restaurant in Chicago that same year. Our first customer, Charlie Trotter, was rated #1 in the world for food and wine by Wine Spectator magazine. We capitalized on the popular farm-to-table movement. Had we filled out the paperwork, we'd have made the Inc. 5000 list in 2011 as one of the fastest-growing independent businesses in the United States, with product being served at O'Hare Airport, the Sears Tower, Wrigley Clubhouse, and Disney, just to name a few. Today, we are in fight for our life. I'd love to tell you that rural America has thrived with niche marketing wholesale opportunities like I once had. I'd love to tell you that dealing with USDA is easy rather than the major challenge it is. Finding, keeping, and affording a skilled workforce in today's de-skilled industry is virtually impossible. Market access for small, local, regional plants in today's wholesale, predatory, and concentrated marketplace is no longer possible. Food that tastes better and is better for you, agriculture that rebuilds soils and community, food system resilience, greater biodiversity, and more opportunities for all should be the goal. The global food supply is in peril. For too long, get big or get it out policies touting false efficiencies and economy of scale have favored today's failed top-down controlled and concentrated food system, wiping out the safer, more dependable, and resilient local regional infrastructure, essential for our food security. The issue to me is like the local Little League committee. We aren't here to argue balls and strikes. We need a new game where everyone has a chance for success, including us smaller, scrappy players who are willing to put the time and energy into it. New processing plants quickly realize that attaining a grant of inspection from USDA is a difficult hill to climb. Only after we climb the USDA inspection hill do we see the mountain, fair market access, today's insurmountable challenge. Fixing USDA inspection issues is the first step in rebuilding local regional food systems. I've spent several decades of my own time and resources doing advocacy work for the independent family farm and small processor. If we want successful local and regional food systems, we need subsidy reform, antitrust enforcement, truth in labeling, and inspection reform. And we must support the infrastructure with government purchasing. Here are my suggestions on inspection reform and antitrust enforcement. First and foremost, we need to create an ombudsman to deal with USDA dysfunction concerning existing and prospective small and very small establishments. Small plants have more issues with the process than they do with the regulations. It's First, Fourth, and 14th Amendment issues, i.e. the ability to challenge and criticize without retribution, the differences in opinions when plants have facility, product, and/or equipment retained, and the ability to have realistic due process during unprofessional inspection behavior and/or differences in opinion. There are way too many nightmare stories. We could go on all day talking about those. We need to redefine plant size, so that overtime fees, grant funds, procurement funds, and implementation of regulations are actually appropriate. And you guys need to look at the National Advisory Committee for Meat and Poultry Inspection. I served on that, and we don't actually even get to present topics for the committee. I have some, ensure that rulemaking processes are complete before USDA enforces rules. Salmonella performance standards, excellent example. And we need to do everything we can to expand the Talmadge-Aikens cooperative state inspection. Most of the little plants in this country are actually in those because they can deal with the politics and bureaucracy of state programs easier. Please restore truth in labeling. Every viable niche we've come up with has been stole by big ag without any meaningful change. USDA procurement program should prioritize some of its purchasing from local and regional suppliers, fix the agency revolving door and ethics issues, and restore strict antitrust enforcement. Oligopolies and monopolies harm both producers and consumers. It's clear that cheap food isn't cheap. Today, the essentially unregulated big food cartel continues to extract the wealth and resources of rural America, while local independent businesses claim to be the backbone of America fail under abusive regulatory pressure and lack of market access. The people who best steward our land and livestock and who grow and process our nation's agricultural production are being left to die under the boot of monopoly power, unprotected and unrepresented at all levels of government. It's time for change. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Gunthorpe, and thank you to all the witnesses who speak from experience. I'm now going to recognize the ranking member, Mr. Hank Johnson from Georgia, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this hearing on barriers to entry and competition in meat processing. In my state of Georgia, we have nearly 50 poultry processors alone, with at least 2 in my district. Although concentration in meat processing is an issue industry-wide, no other sector is more vertically integrated than the poultry industry. 54% of all chicken processing is controlled by just 4 giant corporations: Tyson, JBS, Marfrig, and Seaboard. While these poultry processors account for more than half of the market, this was not always the case. In 1986, for instance, these companies only controlled 35% of the market. Chicken integrators, who perform a similar function as meat packers, such as Tyson Foods or Pilgrim's Pride, control every step of the poultry production, from breeding to slaughtering. Chicken growers across the country and in my state are contract farmers. They sign contracts to grow chicks on a roughly 6-week basis, and they must agree to substantial capital commitments. At a hearing before the USDA and DOJ, poultry farmers explained how this process forced them to take on debt, had little security that their contracts with the big chicken companies would last long enough for them to pay off their debts, and they faced retaliation, such as losing their contracts if they complained. Dominance in this sector has resulted in measurable harms to our local farmers. The Small Business the Small Business Administration Office of the Inspector General found in 2018 that the large chicken companies exercise, quote, such comprehensive control over growers, end quote, that it nullifies, quote, practically all of a grower's ability to operate their business independently, end quote. More than half of all chicken growers only have 1 or 2 potential integrators in their area, and growers claim that even when they have multiple integrators nearby, they do not, as a matter of practice, compete for growers. The dominance of just 4 large corporations in this sector does not hurt just the farmers and meat suppliers, but it also affects worker wages and consumer prices. Although large meat processing plants should result in lower operating costs that should positively impact workers' wages and consumer prices, these big firms have instead used their control over the market to extract more profit from the system while paying workers less and charging consumers more. Charging consumers for meat is not a small issue. Meat prices are the single largest contributor to the rising cost of groceries. Finally, as the COVID-19 pandemic demonstrated, our reliance on these 4 meat processors has created a fragile food supply system that contains numerous bottlenecks that are highly sensitive to shocks in the market. For all these reasons, we should closely examine what we can do as members of the Judiciary Committee to increase competition in the meat processing market, protect workers, and ensure that smaller meat plants are getting the support they need to compete and thrive. Although federal standards for meat processing facilities can pose a high burden to smaller processors, we should explore ways of supporting them and breaking up the big 4 meat processing companies, not rolling back inspection regulations that have roots in the late 1800s and support a safe and sanitary food system. Maybe we should add more federal workers to get the job done efficiently and effectively, and hopefully those workers can have a heart and treat the people that they work with humanely and with some compassion. I thank the witnesses for coming here today. I want to especially thank Ms. Baumann, our Queen Esther exemplar, and thank you all for sharing your perspectives, and I yield back the balance of my time.
I thank the ranking member. We'll now begin the questions, and we'll proceed under the 5-minute rule. I'm going to yield to the chairman of the full committee, Mr. Jordan.
I thank the chairman. Mr. Salatin, I think, said it best when he said they trust their farmer more than a government agent. Amen to that. I mean, someone once said when someone from the government shows up at your front door, your first response is not usually, "Oh joy, one of my public servants is here to help me today." That is the fundamental issue, and I appreciate what the chairman's doing and everyone's testimony. It's amazing. We got 4 witnesses. I don't know which one came from the Democrats, but they all understand we got to change this system. So God bless you all for what you do. I'm going to yield to the good man who knows a little bit about agriculture from Wisconsin, Mr. Tiffany.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I believe you used the phrase, Mr. Salatin, rule without restraint. I wrote a letter on August 27th, 2021 to the Food Safety Inspection Service. It actually went to Secretary Vilsack in regards to forced mask mandates that were put on processing facilities. And as I quoted in here, they do not have the authority to abate hazardous conditions directly. That was what FSIS said. They do not have the authority. Do you see these things regularly from the Food Safety Inspection Service?
Yes, there is, as I mentioned, the word extortion. I mean, the problem is that if you dare question a judgment, because of the subjective nature of inspection, it's not empirical at all. They can retribute pretty easily. And so every owner of a plant like us has been down this road where, well, I mean, I can tell you an example for us that happened in the last 5 years. We've had 2 new inspectors at our plant. Because we're a small plant, it's a training ground for new ones. And so because we sell grass-finished beef, not grain-finished, many times our liver has just a bit of a green patina around the edge because it's not feedlot. So 2 years in the last 5, we've had new inspectors that condemned all of our livers. That's $30,000 a year. Times 2 is $60,000 a year. We take them 50 miles up to another plant with another inspector. all of our livers come back. Same animals, same farm, same day, same rules. One, we lose several thousand. One, we gain several thousand. But if you dare question or say anything, then, well, you know, we can find a fly here, we can find a post wrong here, this room has to be blue instead of pink, you know, and so you just are under this extortion all the time.
Yeah, it kind of brings back a funny story, Mr. Chairman. When I was a kid on the dairy farm, all of the dairy farmers in the area used to always say, you got to make sure you got one thing wrong for the inspector to see, because you can't get a perfect score. Mr. Gunthorpe, I believe you used the phrase presumed guilty. I think you used that in your testimony. To this same point, is this something that you found also?
You know, as I mentioned in my testimony, I think that we see this on a regular basis, and I would argue that, and I've actually read the regulations. I probably could cite any of them imaginable, but I think the problem is the interpretation and is the dysfunction that we see with the inspection. And as I mentioned, I think it's our First Amendment rights, because I think it's our ability to challenge and criticize the inspectors, and we can't do that because of, as Mr. Salatin said, you know, retaliation. I think it's the, we can't question or even have them have proper probable cause or suspicion when they either withhold our ability to use our facility, our equipment, or hold our product. And then we don't have legitimate due process in this. If I actually wanted to fight over an issue with the USDA, I'd have to go completely through the appeal process. So starting at the inspector that wrote us up for non-compliance, I'd have to go through the whole way through the chain of command before I could get an administrative court hearing. So I'd have 2 years that we wouldn't be open without even being able to get due process. That's not due process.
Thank you very much for that. I just got a brief time. Mr. Gunthorpe, you sound like you could be interchangeable with our ALEC representative here. I really appreciate the Democrats bringing you forward. To the ranking member, you hope they have a heart. You hope these regulators have a heart, but sometimes that is not how it works. And you force some of these plants to close. We've seen it in our district where we have a plant closing, and they were subject to those mask mandates. And it really did great harm to their business. And I know it caused them to reconsider whether they should do an expansion. And I would just close with this, Mr. Chairman. We are so fortunate in Wisconsin. We have, I believe, almost 500 of these small processors. Many states do not have the diversity of processors. I get a quarter to a half every year, my wife and I do, from one of those small plants. We are so fortunate. I hope this can happen in the rest of the country. I yield back to the chairman, or yield back to you, Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Tiffany, and I'm going to yield to the ranking member of the full committee at this moment for questions, Mr. Nadler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Gunthorpe, the meat processing market is highly concentrated with only 4 firms controlling most of the processing in this country. Why was it important to your family business to start your own plant to become involved in the meat processing plant?
Thank you for the question. We had no choice but to start a processing plant. My family had raised pigs and sold live pigs on the commodity market for 4 generations. The commodity market is virtually done for the independent hog farmer, especially somebody like us that raises, you know, heritage breeds of pigs on pasture seasonally. The commodity market's not going to buy those hogs at any price that we could be profitable. We have no choice but to establish our own markets.
And how hard has it been for your meat processing plant to stay in business and compete against large-scale processing facilities run by one of the big 4 meat processors?
You know, it's been an amazing journey, and you know, unlike Mr. Salatin, we wholesale virtually all of our stuff. We're not direct to consumers, so we sell mostly to restaurants, upscale retailers. And up until about 2015, it was, you know, an amazing journey. You know, we could sell product virtually anywhere. I think that the whole farm-to-table movement woke the big guys up. And the big guys now, with misleading labels, and it's part of the a requirement for antitrust enforcement, is that you have a fair and competitive market. The big guys co-opt every single thing that we produce nowadays, whether that's natural, whether that's grass-fed, whether that's product of USA, whether that's the organic label. Those same big companies dominate all of these markets, and they dominate them without the production
More since
practices like we have.
2015.
What?
You implied more since 2015.
Oh, it's been, I mean, it started in about 2015. You know, we corresponded to it in, by expanding our region. You know, we sell outside of our local region, sell, you know, as far west as Oregon, as far south as Florida, into Pennsylvania and New York. But, you know, expanding your region only works for so long. You know, eventually, when it becomes, you know, I should send you a link to the Joe Rogan show, a good friend of mine, Will Harris, explaining his whole situation with Whole Foods. But, I mean, it's all of the niche farmers that are wholesaling.
Thank you. Mr. Gunthorpe, how do USDA inspections help protect the quality and safety of the meat produced and ensure the health and well-being of the livestock?
You know, I think there should be some improvements in the USDA inspection system, but I'm actually a fan of USDA inspection. I think for the overwhelming majority of meat and poultry sold in the United States, we need a basic, you know, standard for safety and wholesomeness. And, you know, USDA is supposed to be there to be another set of eyes to ensure that we're doing what we're supposed to do. And I would say about 80% of the inspectors fall in that category. You actually got a problem with 10%. I like to call them the lazies and the crazies. You got 10% that don't do their job, and they're a problem for both us as a plant and consumers. And then you got 10% that there's not a person on the planet that can make them happy. And USDA has nothing whatsoever to do to be able to deal with those inspectors. And little plants can't deal with them at all. So you guys really need to fix both ends of it.
Now, Chairman Massey's Prime Act would propose to carve out meat sold commercially within the state from the federal baseline inspection requirements. Do you expect consumers in your state to have an appetite for this uninspected meat?
You know, I would say I'm not opposed to the Prime Act. I think that if you put the restrictions pounds-wise the same, we have the equivalent right now in poultry inspection, and it's 1,000 birds per year and 20,000 birds per year. And we don't have problems with that. And Indiana is actually one of the exemplary states. I would tell Mr. Johnson that Georgia is actually right now eliminating their.
Thank you. I have two more questions, okay, which I'll ask as one. Are there tracing mechanisms in use at the state level that are like the tracing that a USDA inspection supplies? And if meat is sold without a USDA inspection mark and thus unable to be traced, how might consumers who later fall ill thanks to contaminated meat find out if the meat came from a specific meat processing location?
You know, I think that it's that accountability of actually the person buys from the actual producer and processor. So I think that's the tracing there. You know, that's where I say we need USDA inspection when it's a no-name transaction and it's in the grocery store and you don't know who the producer or the processor is. That's what USDA creates at basic level there. When it's an interaction between two people, the traceability is you know the person you got the meat from.
Thank you. My time has expired. I yield back.
I thank you, Mr. Nadler, and I yield 5 minutes to Mr. Klein for his questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you for holding this important hearing on this critical topic. I support your legislation. I've been a co-sponsor for many years, and it's important to my district. And I want to welcome my constituent, Mr. Salatin, here today. The 6th District of Virginia is the #1 agriculture district in the Commonwealth. And And I see that he has been writing nonstop since he gave his testimony, and everybody else has been asking questions. So I'm going to give you a minute just to kind of respond to what was said before I launch into my questions. But one thing Mr. Tiffany mentioned was the proliferation of small processors in Wisconsin. And I asked him why and what was the kind of reason for that magic that happens in Wisconsin as opposed to what might happen in Virginia. But Mr. Salatin, thank you for being here.
Well, I mean, Wisconsin, you know, has a really small farm. You know, it's the cheese capital. It has a really small farm feel about it. To my knowledge, you know, Purdue is not there. Tyson's not there. So, in Virginia, we have Smithfield, and so it just has a small farm feel. I think also that as you head into Wisconsin, you get a kind of, it's not in the center, it's out there, and a lot of homesteaders are moving to Wisconsin, and so it's got that small, that smallholder feel.
Well, in Virginia, we have a state-level program that allows meat to be inspected and sold for intrastate commerce. However, we're one of only 27 states that have this kind of program in place. How would the PRIME Act improve on our system in Virginia, if at all?
Well, the PRIME Act would allow by-the-cut sales. And I know Mr. Nadler has kept harping on safety, 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 but we've got to realize that safety is actually quite subjective. I think a lot of people do things that are unsafe, like drinking 3 Cokes a day is pretty unsafe. Maybe even, well, I'll not go too far here, but there are a lot of things that people do that are unsafe. Maybe bungee jumping. I mean, whatever. Okay, and so 50 kids drowned in backyard swimming pools last year. That's more than have ever been hurt by any kind of meat problem. But we're not filling in swimming pools. What I'm saying is you choose your risk. It's a personal choice of how you choose your risk. And so the beauty of the PRIME Act creates a parallel competition based on voluntary consensual choice among adults to opt out of a system. Just like homeschooling has now created a competition and opt-out chance and charter schools for people that are upset with the public school, don't trust the public school system, or Uber created an opt-out option for the chauffeuring business, or Airbnb created an opt-out position for the hospitality industry. We need an opt-out. The only way to really break up these big outfits is to create a universe that allows a competitive free market option. And so the PRIME Act allows a competitive free market option that will then create accountability within the system.
You have a long history of helping small farmers and processors get started in the industry and navigate federal laws, USDA regulatory requirements, and food safety inspector relationships. But starting at the beginning, what are the biggest problems faced by processors in just getting a grant of inspection that enables the facility to even operate?
The biggest problems we're getting around inspection?
No, getting a grant of inspection.
Oh, getting a grant of inspection. It's basically a $2 million process. You've got $1 million to build a facility and $1 million to get the paperwork done.
And once a facility is operating, what difficulties do processors face in complying with all of the federal laws and regulations?
Well, I think you've heard a lot of it right here.
Heard a lot.
When we were talking here before the meeting, Greg, Mr. Gunthorpe, sorry to be formal here, mentioned that if we started down the path of each of us telling stories, we could be here well into the night. And the problem is that these stories don't have easy resolutions because of the non-appellant situation within the industry. So that's why trying to say, be nice, agency, FSIS, could you be nicer? Could you be kinder? That doesn't work. The reform needs to come from an option that allows people to take control of their own microbiome.
Thank you for being part of a discussion that's long overdue. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman from Virginia, and I recognize Ms. Jayapal now for her question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. After decades of corporate consolidation, small and independent farmers are limited to fewer, larger meat processing facilities to prepare their product for consumption. Over 20 years ago, the market share of the 2 largest meatpacking firms was 21%. Today, there are just 4 companies, these are the 4 companies that occupy over 50% of the market, even though there are almost 6,000 meat processing businesses in the United States. And these conditions, as we're hearing, have led to a scarcity of options for many independent farmers, many of whom must now travel great distances to process their meat. I really appreciated, Mr. Gunthorpe, your description of the boot of monopoly power. I think that is an apt description for how small independent farmers are being crushed. And before we get to that, I just wanted to pick up on something that Mr. Salatin was just saying. Do you think that the essential components of food safety is subjective? Yeah.
Yes, I think it is. As I mentioned earlier, 80% of the inspectors, by my estimation, do a great job, are there to ensure we have safe and wholesome food supply. 10% of them probably don't do their job, and 10%.
But that 80% are judging on standards that it sounds like you think are appropriate. They are core essential functions of food safety?
Yeah, employee hygiene, pre-operational, operational sanitation, ensuring that you're meeting critical control points. I mean, those things are essential whether we'd have USDA there or not.
Thank you. So they're essential. I just wanted to make it clear that it's not like we're looking at food safety and saying this is a whole set of things that we can just judge whether or not they're safe. There are certain clear standards, and that is what the regulators are trying to regulate. And I understand your point. You've been nuanced in saying that they're not necessarily all doing a great job. I understand the things we need to do better, but that you're in favor of having some regulations and that the majority, 80% of them, do a good job.
Oh, yeah, those 4 large corporations, and even down to a much smaller scale, it'd be a free-for-all if we didn't have inspection. But I still think person to person is a different.
Of course, understood. The U.S. Department of Agriculture reported in 2002 that firm concentration in hog slaughter increased from 30% in 1989 to 57% in 1999. In 2004, Mr. Gunthorpe, you began operating your own USDA-inspected processing plant due to limited processing availability. Can you talk about why you think there was limited processing availability at that time?
I mean, that's a story that would probably take a whole book, but, the hog industry consolidated. The big guys kept getting bigger and, pushed out the little guys. And as I mentioned earlier, in 1998, we sold live pigs for less than what my grandpa sold them for in the Depression. We really had no choice but to quit the hog market. It was over. It went from 600,000 hog farmers to 60,000 today. Everybody quit.
Yeah.
We just chose to try a different path so that I could still raise pigs.
Yeah, and you've been really successful at that. You've maintained your processing facility for almost 20 years. As companies have consolidated more during that time, has access to processing facilities improved?
In some ways it's improved, but in lots of ways that it's got worse. And I tell people, processing plants disappeared, but we forget the kind of processing plants that farmers need to be able to direct market had completely gone away. The little processors that had a truck that did a route, that actually made a whole bunch of different products, served restaurants and retailers, those didn't exist when we started direct marketing. We've had to rebuild this whole processing
You've had to
sector.
really rethink the whole thing.
Yep.
Currently, just 4 companies, as I mentioned, control more than half of the market in chicken processing, close to 70% in pork, and nearly 3/4 in beef. How does that consolidated power, I mean, we've spoken to this in different ways, but briefly, how does that consolidated power impact the pricing for independent farmers and consumers?
It drastically impacts, the pricing for farmers and consumers. We've been told economy of scale, and I have a degree in economics from Purdue University, but it realistically has not worked for farmers or producers. It has not increased farmers' prices, it's drastically reduced farmers' prices, and it's increased consumers' prices. All of that improvement has went to the people of the middle. And in my opinion, the Department of Justice, the USDA, and the Federal Trade Commission have been on vacation since the 1970s on antitrust issues.
And they're absolutely agree, and they're coming back in a big way, and I really support
I'm ready
that.
for them to go back to work.
Fantastic. Well, I really appreciate it. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Jayapal. I now recognize the chairman of the IP Subcommittee, Mr. Issa, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is an incredibly important hearing, and Hopefully I can ask a couple questions to bring a few things out. Mr. Salatin, you're probably the most qualified to answer a fairly straightforward question. Is there a record of a difference between state inspection and USDA inspection as to tainted meat getting into the market?
I don't know. I assume that there is some database that records.
But are you aware of any record that somehow the states didn't care enough about people's health where the federal government did a better job?
Oh, no, the federal government never does a better job.
Okay, I'll take that for the record. So,
and probably not even a better job than a direct farmer to consumer where a farmer doesn't have a bureaucracy to hide behind.
and similarly, I once worked in a slaughterhouse. I worked for Rabbi Kazin, and I'm not sure how far over 1,000 chickens he went, but let me assure you there were hundreds every single day as I came to work, so it was a lot. And he slaughtered them according to religious beliefs. We stripped the feathers off, we soaked them in brine, and later that day I got to deliver them in a very old station wagon to one after another customers if I was lucky, because I got tipped for that. I didn't get tipped for slaughtering. So is there a record similarly of the small processor, including the one-of-a-kind rabbi who operates both retail and wholesale? Is there any history that small is somehow less able to do the job properly?
Not to my knowledge.
So as we see over 50% of processing done by just 4 processors, and we see, to my recollection, that most of the time when I hear about it, they're the ones that have the shutdowns and the recalls and so on. Now, maybe that's because of their volume, but it doesn't seem like bigger is better from a standpoint of safety. Is that fair?
It's absolutely fair. Just like, think about your own kitchen. If you're cooking 5 meals a day in your own kitchen, it's a lot easier to keep it clean than if suddenly you're doing 50. Scale does matter.
Ms. Ballman, you haven't been asked very much, but would you like to, as we say here, opine on those 2 questions of bigger versus better and who cares more about the health and safety, the processor and your local inspector, or somebody who's brought in from somewhere in the country for USDA?
Yeah, I would say from a safety perspective, if there's any difference between small processors versus large, it depends maybe which database you'd be looking at, because if the USDA does publish all of the testing that goes on in small and large plants. They have a public access database. I don't know how to get there, but and you will find that the small plants do have a higher incident rate of testing failures. However, that's all you would want to call the word failure, but that is directly proportionate to the ratio of product tested. So small plants are tested an incredibly lot more than large plants.
Okay.
So they can look really bad on the database until you realize which representation you're looking at. But from a state versus USDA, I'm not aware of any difference in that either.
Mr. Gunthorpe, I could ask either of you this, but is it fair to say that when your name is on the meat and your business goes from whatever it is to 0, maybe permanently from a standpoint of high-end restaurants and so on buying, that you're probably more likely to pull back any dubious meat because you cannot afford to have your brand hurt, where quite frankly, the majors, yes, they have a brand, but they've had all these problems and they survive them.
I tell people all the time there's a huge correlation between food quality and food safety. And, if you're selling to high-end restaurants, high-end retailers, our name is all about quality. So we can't put anything out there. Small guys with 1 recall are done. Big guys, no name, it's on.
I'm going to have a rhetorical question for a moment for the record, and that is a big chunk of our meat, not the majority, but a chunk of it comes from outside the United States. I think of New Zealand, lamb, and so on. And my understanding is it's inspected when it gets here. So to a great extent, meats from around the world enjoy the ability of being inspected after the fact rather than intrusive visits to the factory. And that may, in fact, be just as much of a double standard for the USDA to try to explain. So with that, Mr. Chairman, that one was for the record. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Issa. Now you'll recognize Mr. Correa for his questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just thank you for holding this most important hearing. And as I think about your comments, USDA versus the Prime Act, we've got to have safety standards. I don't represent an area that we do any farming, primarily very urban in Southern California. We still care about safety of the products we consume. USDA, I've heard testimony today, fixing the USDA inspection. Do we need a nicer, kindler USDA? And Ms. Baumann, you mentioned this in your comments that you get inspected more often. You feel you're held to a higher level of scrutiny because you're small versus the larger, the big four, so to speak. Is that because they're trusted more than you are? What is it, in your opinion, that drives more scrutiny of your operation as opposed to the larger guys?
Well, part of it is just how the regulations are written, and exemptions made for high-speed slaughter. So whenever animals are being slaughtered, an inspector is required to be present because of I can do far fewer in a day. What I do in a day is equivalent to like maybe what some of them do in a second. They have more time to see more stuff, bottom line. It doesn't mean that the big guys don't mess up more.
The inspection of your process, your product sounds to be more safe than that of a high-speed operation.
I would tend to think so myself. Likewise.
Is there an ombudsman? Is there an inspector? Do you have a personal relationship with your personal USDA person that comes out to see you?
You have to, because you're with them literally all the
They
time.
would know how you do business, that you don't take shortcuts, that you're actually there to do a good job.
Half of the skill of being a USDA and plant owner is developing that relationship. So because they're your coworker, you have to figure out how to get along and how to achieve they can do their job, you can achieve your goals.
I'm trying to get at why is it that you have same rules, same regulations, same set of law, same objectives, yet the outcomes seem to be different. You're held to a higher level of scrutiny, when safety appears to be something that at the end of the system is accomplished, so to speak. So how do we change the system so that you're as competitive as the big four and you can essentially compete with the rest and those benefits of competition are passed on to my consumers?
Some of that would be, I'm never going to achieve the level of, I'm never going to be able to reduce my levels of inspection, if that makes sense, like the big guys can, because I can't.
I don't want you to reduce the levels of inspection. What I want you to do is be able to work with the USDA so you're not at a competitive disadvantage.
Part of that is plant owner education. I don't have the resources that Tyson does to explain microbiology and defend my practices. I don't have the resources to
Explain that to who?
What's that?
Explain that to who?
To the inspectors, because everything I do in my plant has to be backed with scientific documentation to prove that I'm not doing anything to make my product worse. And so one, there's the small plant owner doesn't have that depth of knowledge. In Tyson, they can fly someone in if they need to know more information, and that's a rhetorical company name there, but in the large processors. But additionally, so it is that the small processors are don't have the knowledge base by means of who they are, if that would explain it. And then there is the FSIS is, I guess, diametrically
Let me cut you off in
opposed
the last
to.
30 seconds that I have.
Okay, go ahead.
What would you, all of you, would you have a set of recommendations for us to look at, short of course, the Prime Act, if we have to continue to work with USDA? What would be some of the top 2 or 3 recommendations that you would have to make your business models more successful?
Well,
I only have 15 seconds,
Sure.
but I'd welcome some testimony if you could provide
I would
that to
say
my
two
office.
things. Once again, not requiring inspection of stuff that doesn't need it. So back to, if stuff's exempt, if it's being directly sold to consumers, let me save some time with the inspector and do the stuff that needs it. The other thing is being able to have a better conversation, an ombudsman, a mediation board, for when me and the inspector have a disagreement, we have somebody to go to, and we don't waste a year trying to get our voice heard.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield.
Thank you, Mr. Correa. Now, recognize Mr. Gates for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm a proud co-sponsor of the Prime Act. I appreciate this hearing, if for no other reason than I'm not going to eat the bugs. So I'm here for the where's the beef hearing. Mr. Chairman, I would also observe that there's a great deal of economic opportunity here as we look at the buying patterns of millennials. There's often great interest in having a greater connection to the farmer or the individual who is involved directly in the production of that food source, rather than moving through a lot of these branded processors. And so if we were to pass the Prime Act, I don't just think we would achieve a great regulatory accomplishment, but I think you would actually be able to sell product at a higher price to people who are willing to pay it by virtue of that direct consumer relationship that is only being impaired right now because of what the government has done, wrapping the apparatus of government around these large businesses. But I'm sure I'll learn a great deal more yielding my time to Ms. Hagman of Wyoming and allowing her to ask some questions.
Well, thank you, Mr. Gates, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here as well. I'm also proud to be a co-sponsor of the Prime Act. Wyoming is one of the 29 states currently operating a state inspection program known as the Meat and Poultry Inspection Program, and under current law, as has been repeated here several times, the meat processed at the state-inspected plants can only be sold intrastate. Now, as a product of my family ranch outside of Fort Laramie, Wyoming, and having dozens of family members who are in the livestock business, I can assure everyone here and the American public that every farmer and rancher and every meat processing facility has every incentive to protect our meat supply and ensure the safe handling of our food. One of the other reasons that we are here today is to rebut some of the misguided arguments pertaining to this bill, and arguments which are mainly coming from the large corporations and packers who have essentially a monopoly when it comes to meat pricing and packing. Mr. Trotter, if the Prime Act became law, do you believe that farmers and ranchers would abandon the existing supply chains whereby they sell to the feedlots, which then serve the existing meat processors and packers, or would they continue to use the same process that they use now?
I think you'd see an expansion. You'd have a lot of the big feedlots have their purpose. These large industries do have their purpose, but what you have here is an opportunity for small businesses to expand. This would just be a result in net economic growth here. The large processors do have their place, but when it comes to local businesses, like within your own state, making sure that they have products, from the farm down the road that didn't need to be trucked 300 miles away to get processed at a USDA facility, there is a market for that. It's simply an expansion of everything else. You're not going to see the big four necessarily go away, but you are going to see competition around the edges, and you're going to see the biggest benefit for the smaller producers.
Well, so I think it's fair to say then that the Prime Act merely gives farmers and ranchers more options when it comes to selling their cattle, and these increased options in turn provide increased benefits to the producers and stave off vertical integration, as well as allowing these producers to determine their own destiny rather than being at the mercy of the packers. We contacted some of the producers in the state of Wyoming and asked them to weigh in on some of the challenges that they have related to producing food, producing our beef and pork, chicken, et cetera. One of the things that I thought was interesting was a comment from one of my constituents who said that our industry is crippled by the endless regulations coming from the EPA, FDA, and USDA. We spend countless dollars and hours tracking, documenting, and proving things that we do as a regular part of our operation. We have to pay experts to file reports because the regulations are so complicated to follow. A few examples of our struggles include VFD rules, CAFO nutrient management regulations, cattle tagging rules, and animal feeding operations and registrations. The other challenges that they talked about is that there is the industry monopoly that has been discussed several times today. And then the other thing is the unwillingness of the packers to work with our cattle producers, our livestock producers, to actually address the price. We also have to be concerned about continued vertical integration. And these are all challenges that our small businesses, our farmers and ranchers, really the backbone of so many of our communities are facing with overregulation. I want to thank all of you for being here today, for sharing your stories, for discussing the importance of the Prime Act, and for coming to Congress to find ways that we can fix the problems that your industries are suffering from. I can tell you that we're all committed to doing that. We're all committed to making sure that we're providing a safe food supply for the American citizens, the great people of this country. So again, thank you for everything, and I yield back.
The gentleman from Florida yields back, and I'll recognize Ms. Scanlon from Pennsylvania for her question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you for calling today's hearing so we have the opportunity to highlight the high degree of consolidation that has occurred in our agricultural industry. Obviously not a new problem for the country. Consolidation in grain, livestock, and meat processing has plagued the U.S. since the 1800s. And it was those early monopolies that set the stage to pass most of our key antitrust laws that guide our policy to this day. But a lot of Americans don't realize how consolidated, particularly the meat processing industry, has become, and that just a handful of companies make, process, and sell most of the food that we eat, although they do know that over the past 3 years, they've seen their food prices go up at the grocery store. The economic shocks of COVID and the Russian invasion of Ukraine have certainly highlighted the urgent need to introduce more competition. And where there's only 2 or 3 companies producing a staple good like grain, eggs, or formula, any disruption of one company can lead to shortages and higher prices. So today we're talking about meat processing. We've heard that 3 or 4 or 5 companies control between 50 to 70% of the various markets. And in the past couple years, we've seen these companies use their size to push higher prices onto consumers while charging farmers less for livestock and shortchanging worker wages and working conditions. So the handful of meat processing plants that control the lion's share of the market have used their dominance in the market to reap record profits. And the question for Congress should be how to address both food safety and competition, because deregulating large sectors of the meat industry doesn't really solve either problem. I'm particularly concerned about eliminating food safety regulations that might push serious health costs onto consumers. And this includes both the ability to afford and purchase food that's been inspected and is safe, because not everyone's a millennial able to purchase high-end goods, as well as the impact of health costs if safety regulations are not enforced in order to help drive down costs, but then people get sick. So I think the Agriculture Committee is the proper place to have an informed debate about USDA and food regs and how they need to be improved. And in fact, traditionally, that's where bills in this region have been referred. But if the goal is lower prices and more choices for consumer, then improved and targeted antitrust enforcement is needed to help create that competition. It's more independent farmers, food processors, options for achieving those goals. And bills like the Prohibiting Anti-Competitive Mergers Act or the Food and Agribusiness Merger Moratorium and Antitrust Review Act are going to be helpful. So I would love it if we were able to look at policies to strengthen the FTC and the USDA so they can break up monopolies, block bad mergers, and protect consumers and workers and farmers from some of these unfair prices. And I think that is probably a better focus for this committee. But Mr. Gunther, can you talk a little bit from, the boots on the ground perspective about how large meat processors are using their size to squeeze our independent farmers, and how they're using that size and influence to shape new regulations in a way that hurts our smaller farmers and food producers?
Sure. I think first of all, we have to look at the fact that I don't think most people realize about 25 beef slaughter plants, 40 pork slaughter plants, and only 200 poultry slaughter plants slaughter almost all of the meat in this country. It's 86% of the beef, 90% of the pork for those. So this is a very real problem. And I'm here to warn you today that this problem is no longer just a United States problem. These companies are multinational corporations that are doing this globally, and they're taking this wealth that they're extracting from rural America right now to buy up processing and slaughter capacity globally. This is going to be a monopoly worldwide unless we address it today. So it causes consumers harm, it causes farmers harm, it creates a lack of opportunities in rural America. If you look at the economic metrics of rural America, they're worse than the inner cities. This is because of concentration and consolidation taking away opportunities. Most farmers nowadays don't even own the livestock or poultry on their farm. We've returned to a feudal serf system.
Well, thank you. Really appreciate your insights, particularly about how that monopolization is global and really hurting our American farmers. So thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Scanlon. I recognize Ms. Sparks from Indiana for questions.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. It's my honor to be here with fellow farmers. I said I've been involved in a lot of businesses, but this is one of the toughest ones when you depend on government and God. So I appreciate being here, also my fellow Hoosier. We've seen that food security is also national security issues, especially during COVID times, and we see what the power oligopolies have right now in many parts of the market, but including food processing. We're creating oligarchs, cartels, and with some actually child labor issues, including the state of Indiana, which raises very significant concerns. So I appreciate Mr. Chairman having this hearing. And before I came here, since I'm not involved in livestock, I do soybean farming. I actually met with farmers in my district, to get their input. And I wanted to run something by you. I think, Prime Act, it's a great legislation. I'm surprised that we're even dealing with intrastate commerce. I don't know how Congress gets involved into everything, but just one issue they brought up to me was interstate commerce too, where they say we have this one-size-fits-all approach where federal government, centralizing a lot of regulations, but states and businesses have liabilities. If you're not going to follow good, safety laws, you will not be in business for very long. The same states, they have agriculture as a big part of GDP of states. They have an interest, to have good production and good standards, but, there is some flexibility, and like some regulations, Indiana Department of Environmental Management has quite more stringent even the federal government, so you actually can apply to local markets. So one thing that they brought up, to give more flexibilities for states to do inspection with also state inspectors, not maybe this large, huge processes would be dealing, with, just USDA inspectors, but states can develop, standards within the state to deal with smaller processes where would be more competition, and bring, ability for actually this mid-sized companies to survive because they cannot hire expensive attorneys and scientists and everything else, but they might not need it because they don't have that large type of mechanic processes that maybe some other ones. So I think, Mr. Trotter, I wanted, since you are representing organization of state legislators, I used to be a member of, and actually got an Iron Lady award from them, but I wanted to get your thoughts on actually maybe doing more flexibility in the Farm Bill for states to have ability to do these inspections for interstate commerce too.
Yeah, so for commerce within a state, it's an intrastate commerce question, not an interstate commerce question. The federal government definitely has jurisdiction on interstate commerce, but at the end of the day, this is a federalism question. Does the authority lie with the federal government or does it lie with the state government? And if we're talking about commerce within its own borders, inspection within its own borders for things that only stay in their own borders, that's clearly a state authority that's been subsumed by the federal government. And it's something that Congress has the ability to go ahead and delegate back to the states, and it's
Sure, they will ask about delegated back, but what about interstate commerce? To have more flexibility for in-state inspectors also to do some inspection maybe for smaller plants, you know, for interstate commerce also, because we don't have to regulate everything, and we can set baseline, but we don't have to one-size-fits-all approaches because states are so unique in agriculture.
Yeah, states are the laboratories of democracy. We have 50 different opportunities in this great nation to go ahead and figure out what works, but you have to enable states to be able to do this without doing a one-size-fits-all. And right now, what we have is a one-size-fits-all system, the same thing that goes through these vertically integrated multinational conglomerates, as what happens with, you know, the small producers that are here at the table with me.
Maybe Mr. Sullivan, if you can briefly, each of our presenters, just get your thoughts on that too. Mr. Salatin?
Yeah, so the germination tray for innovation is embryonic prototypes. You cannot have solutions to problems without prototype innovation. You don't start big, you start small. And so one of the problems we have right now is that with this overarching federal domination of state choice, all right, if a state, for example, Maine, when they did their food sovereignty law, they said in Maine, if a farmer and a consumer want to work together, we're not going to get a bureaucrat involved. That's fine. Somebody at church, you know, you want to sell, we're not going to get involved. As soon as they passed the law, here came federal in and said, if you do that, we're going to withdraw all inspection from the state. Maine won't be able to sell anything to anybody out of the state. And so immediately Maine caved and it was gone. So this body right here has the chance to offer innovative experimentation opportunities for our 50-state experiment. We hear safety. Oh, people are going to get sick if we have uninspected food. We don't know that. Maybe they'll actually be able to afford better food. It'll be more available, and their food system will be more secure. But until this body grants freedom to try, to create a germination tray of innovative ideology, we don't know if we'd have more people, or maybe we'd have healthier people because they wouldn't be condemned to the oligarchy. Maybe that would be the outcome.
Thank you. I think my time has expired. I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Sparks. I now recognize Mr. Ivey for his questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to you and the ranking member for putting this hearing together. Thank you to the panel. I appreciate you coming in and sharing your thoughts and your insights. I come from a district, it's the eastern border of Washington, D.C., so we don't have a lot of processing plants over there, and it's been a long time since I've been on or near a farm. I was a little kid in North Carolina. We lived near one, and my father owned a soybean, actually, somebody mentioned. But you know, for the track here, it seems to me there's sort of two sets of things that are going on that I'm sort of curious about. One is the antitrust issue, and you all haven't talked so much about that. I guess there's been more conversation from up here about that, but the issue seems to be a sense of there's basically four entities that are running the show and controlling the markets, and they're too big, and they're now growing to become international forces in that realm as well. And as Ms. Scanlon pointed out, that would seem to be the area that antitrust legislation or enforcement could address. And I know you've explicitly called for that, Mr. Gunther. And I'm interested in pursuing that. I didn't realize until this hearing that those forces had become that big and had that much market dominance. One of the things, Mr. Chairman, I'd be kind of curious about if we move forward with this, because it's not clear to me exactly the impact your bill would have on those four entities. So from the standpoint of some suggestions, like Mr. Johnson, he's talking about breaking some of them up. And that would be a whole set of hearings, it seems to me, on market forces, economists telling us, well, what would you have to do from a breakup standpoint to actually have an impact to try and address some of these issues? And I'd be very interested in hearing about that. I haven't made a decision one way or the other yet, but I'd be curious about it. Secondly, I think with respect to your bill and some of the things that you've raised, it sounds like some of that would make sense. I live in a community where, we have farmers that come up on the weekends and they sell their goods at the local school or community center, and it happens all over the area. Mr. Gates said something about it's, baby boomers buy that too, right? So, there's an openness to it as well. But I'm not clear on some of the issues as to whether the bill would address that or not. But there were some points that were raised that I think that I really would like to hear more about. I don't know if they're going to be in our jurisdiction or the Agriculture Committee, but Mr. Gunther, you suggested possible issues of reform, redefine plant size. You mentioned inspection reform. Ombudsman, I think, was your suggestion. You mentioned mediation board. As a former litigator, I'd be careful about what you ask for on some of those. But the point I think you're making is that if you have to go all the way down the track of litigating the issue, it could take 2 years and you might be out of business just to challenge one inspector's ruling. I'd be open to trying to figure out ways to find some kind of expedited appeal or resolution to try and address that. Ms. Hageman's also, over different hearings, or brought to our attention the heavy weight that regulations can bring on some of these entities. And you're really at a distinct disadvantage if you're trying to take on Uncle Sam without having a gigantic budget behind you. So I'd be open about that. And I think the truth in labeling issue too, which we didn't get into much, and maybe that's an Agriculture Committee issue too, but I take your point. I go to the grocery store. We actually had a briefing about this a few weeks ago. And there are all these things about whether it's organic or whatever, and it's hard to keep track of what they really mean and who's promising what, and who should I buy from? Because my family and others want to actually support smaller farms and businesses, but it's hard to figure out how to do that sometimes. So, Mr. Chairman, I think there's definitely room for bipartisanship here. I think there are ways that we could find ways to try and address some of that. I do think if we do the antitrust piece, though, one of the questions I'd have is the custom slaughterhouse approach. I think, it might have been Mr. Trotter, I think he used the phrase around the edges, which is important. I think we want to make sure we find ways to help small businesses, small farms to thrive and find their own markets. But if it's not going to have an impact on the larger antitrust issue that Ms. Scanlon identified, and Mr. Johnson did too, I think that can't be our only track for solutions. I think we have to find additional ways to try and address that as well. In short, I think we got to walk and chew gum in dealing with this issue. But Mr. Chairman, I commend you for your legislation and for this hearing. Mr. Johnson, I appreciate your comments too. And I hope that we'll be able to continue working with you and your community to try and find ways to address these issues.
Thank you, Mr. Ivey. Mr. Ivey yields back. I'm going to recognize myself for my questions now. There's been a lot of discussion here, and I want to put it all in context. There's sort of the oligopoly solution where the big meat packers control, and then there's this other path, which is farmers can sell directly to consumers, but they have to sell them the animal. And so these custom slaughterhouses exist because of one exemption right now, these hundreds of thousands of custom slaughterhouses. And that is the farmer can sell the consumer a whole animal or half an animal. And the problem with that is it's regressive. How many families can afford to buy 500 pounds of meat? But that's the only system, the only alternative that exists. So the Prime Act seeks to expand that alternate path, which has made nobody sick, and it's made a lot more people healthier. So I want to talk about, Mr. Salatin, sustainability, affordability, traceability, and safety. Because those are concerns that were all raised.
Yes.
Can you speak to each of those four, and I'll go over them one at a time, sustainability, affordability, traceability, and safety, and talk about how enabling or empowering a more local food system enhances all of those things. It doesn't detract from them.
Yes, we've heard a lot about protecting the public here. it's time to protect the private. And so on sustainability, one of the beauties of offering this kind of choice to the consuming populace is that it does actually create options for farmers and consumers who want to opt out of whatever the system is, whether it's like the Gunthorpe family that opted out of, I don't mean to hit you, that opted out of the industrial pork system, or whether it's a consumer who's wanting to opt out of Walmart. The opt-out option creates a sustainability because it's about resilience. And so when fertilizer, for example, on our farm, when fertilizer jumped 400% when Putin invaded Ukraine, we didn't miss a beat because we don't buy any of it. And these are the kind of farmers that we're dealing with. So it works all the way up the food chain: building soil, earthworms, sustainability. Affordability is a big one because, as you mentioned, not only does the current system require large volume buying. The average American now can't put their hand on $400. So, that you can't buy volume. It's pretty difficult. But because of the overhead and paperwork costs of inspection, it artificially elevates the price of food. And so a custom house operating at a much lower capitalization cost for infrastructure, a lower paperwork cost, can actually do what a federal inspected plant does for, let's just say, $1. It can do it for 75 cents. That cost gets passed on to the product. And so suddenly, not only do we have a sustainable, secure food supply, I mean, does anybody think if we'd had 300,000 smaller plants accessing the country instead of 300 mega plants at COVID, we would have had less of a hiccup in the food system if we'd had 300,000 plants instead of 300. So affordability is a big deal. Traceability is another one. Right now, a typical burger at a burger joint has pieces of 600 animals in it. So if anybody thinks that all those 600 animals in a burger at McDonald's is traceable, I've got a bridge in Brooklyn to sell you. Trust me, it is not traceable, okay? And so the problem is, I think, we've built this system and we have a trust in this system that's actually let us down. It's not working. And what was your fourth one?
Safety.
Safety. That's the big one, because the safest food comes from smaller plants that have, somebody over here, I don't remember who, was talking about branding, that when you put your brand behind it, you have a really vested interest in making sure that that is a safe product. One of the things that you notice with all these recalls, what's the first thing a CEO says as soon as they've got a product recall? Well, we've complied with everything. And the big industry hides behind the skirts of the inspection service all the time. A place like me, we don't have any skirts to hide behind. If we sell bad chicken or bad beef or bad pork chops, it comes back on us. I'll close with this story because I think this is foundational to what we're talking about here. When Michael Pollan wrote Power Steer in the New York Times and basically blew the door off of grass-finished beef market, I got contacted by, I won't mention a name, but the largest fast food chain in the country. And they were interested in offering a grass-finished burger. Well, they saw some of the things that I'd written about them, and they said, maybe we don't want to go visit them. So they sent their DC, their counsel, their retainer attorney down to check us out. And we spent half a day together. And as I was talking about the disparity between the way a small plant and a large outfit deals with these subjective inspections, he said, "Oh, that's just business." He said, "At our place, when we have an overzealous inspector or a little tyrant or one of the 20% top or bottom, they call me. I go to the commissioner at FSIS and get them fired. That's just the way we do business. A small plant like ours, we don't have that kind of clout. We don't have that option. So we're held hostage by this system that I've already said measures their efficacy in pounds per inspector personnel hour. I didn't know that they were measuring efficacy by pounds per hour. I thought it was about safe food. So the whole thing is incentivized to be prejudicial to small outfits, and that's why we need some sort of option that allows a parallel universe to exist, because that's the only way that you can actually create competition and accountability within the monopoly.
Thank you, Mr. Salatin. I now recognize the ranking member of this subcommittee, Mr. Johnson, for his questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to enter into the record a letter dated June 13th, 2023, entitled, "Where's the Beef?" Without objection.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you. And Mr. Trotter, you are here with the American Legislative Exchange Council, which has among its members the organization known as the Americans for Tax Reform, which is Grover Norquist, correct?
Yes.
And you're familiar with his pledge that everybody has signed so as to limit the no new taxes pledge. You're familiar with that state and local and federal legislators have signed, pledging to impose no new taxes, correct?
I have heard of it.
And you have heard of his famous pledge to make the federal government, to shrink it so small that you can drown it in the bathtub. Everybody's heard of that, and you've heard of it too, correct?
It sounds familiar.
Yeah, and so now we've had the DOJ, the Federal Trade Commission, the Antitrust Division of DOJ. I mean, all of these federal agencies that Grover Norquist wants to get rid of, wants to shrink so that you can drown it in the bathtub. And they are the ones responsible for making sure that we don't suffer from a lack of competition policy, which leads to consolidation in the meat packing industry, which is what we're talking about today, correct? I mean, if one side wants to cut the federal government's ability to engage in competition policy, while the other side is talking about, well, we need more competition policy to prevent what we're talking about today, I mean, that's a basic conflict that's hard to resolve. And another thing that the government does is to protect food quality, safety for Americans. And so if we deregulate the Department of Agriculture, as we've been doing, then it hurts its ability to actually perform the service that we need it to perform. And we're here complaining about the bureaucracy not being as quick and agile as it needs to be to deal with small meat processors. And it has a lot to do with the shrinkage of government, which is something that ALEC has been promoting throughout its existence. But tell me this, Mr. Gunthorpe, chicken processors claim that the processors control the system so entirely that the system is akin to sharecropping, where the vertically integrated poultry companies own most of the supply chain and trap small farmers in debt while keeping the farmers' profit margins at a razor-thin edge. How has that consolidation hurt family farmers? And have you ever been a contract grower?
We've never been a contract grower. I ventured off on this wild journey because we would have had a choice. Could have put up contract barns, and I would quit before I'd put up contract barns. The farmers I mentioned earlier, it's a feudal serf system. They own the mortgage, the mortality, and the manure. That's all they own. And the opportunities, there's that whole risk-reward relationship, and they give up some of the risk for no chance at any reward. It's not a system that works.
It's really a system of pimping.
Yeah, but
that the federal government has allowed to take place. But let me ask you this question. The CDC reports that each year, 48 million people get sick from foodborne illness, causing 128,000 people to be hospitalized, and the results also is the death of 3,000 people. Under the Prime Act, slaughterhouses and meat processors would be able to sell meat within their state without having to meet the federal baseline requirements for commercially sold meat. If this bill, the Prime Act, is enacted, would instances of contaminated meat rise? And if so, how could you trace it back to the processor? And are states equipped to meet the challenges posed by the commercial sale of uninspected meat?
I'd love to see you guys invite me back to, it's probably not this committee, but a committee that we could actually talk about food safety from a processor's standpoint. We have about 1 million illnesses from salmonella a year in this country. USDA implemented its salmonella performance standards in 2011. That number of cases of salmonella has done nothing but stay about the same. It's a very complex issue, and food safety takes all the way from production to the plate to solve. And I don't think we've took a holistic approach. USDA takes that approach of right there in the middle, doesn't really look at production, can't legally, nor can they legally look at it after it leaves the plant. And it's complex and complicated, and we really ought to solve it.
Well, you can blame ALEC for that problem.
No, I don't. I think it's more complex than that. And to get back to your other comment, I think it's your guys' job to ensure that deregulation doesn't.
We're all members of ALEC.
Oh, okay. Well, I think it's your guys' job to ensure that deregulation doesn't give the big guys free rein to do whatever while giving the agencies the tools to harass us. And that's my argument. I'm not a fan of what is, quote, text deregulation, because most of the time, from what I see out in the field, it's letting the big guys do what they want while you still allow the tools for the agencies to harass us little guys.
Mr. Gunthorpe, I appreciate your comments and your insight. I agree with you. I think that we do need to have a hearing on food safety and address the specific issues that you've identified.
And a hearing on deregulation on what on the agency capture, because I was involved in the Pew Meridian group that looked at a rewrite of food safety inspection laws, because I think you have 13 agencies, not just USDA, that deals with all of the food safety. I was on the National Advisory Committee for Meat and Poultry Inspection. These are complex issues that we're probably not going to solve today, but we ought to take, you eat an elephant one bite at a time, and we got to start.
Well, then the agency capture is something that has really affected almost every industry in this country, and the livestock packing and food industry is one of them. So I'm going to now recognize Mr. Fitzgerald for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm going to yield my first minute to Ms. Sparks.
Thank you. As a former proud member of ALEC and state legislator, I just wanted to really rebut a little bit what Mr. Johnson just said. We're looking here that not in a top-down approach. The monopoly-oligopoly issue was created by government. It's a not natural monopoly. We're looking how we can create competition for value bottom-up and how we can have more quality delivered to consumer, because unfortunately what's happening right now, federal government hasn't been able to enforce what they need to do and not dealing with core functions, and have, all of this agency, including Federal Trade Commission, been dysfunctional. And all they're doing, they're catering more and more to large special interest groups. They become richer and richer, and we're creating oligarchs and cartels right here in Congress. So I think we have to know how we can help the little guy and create more flexibility and competition on the ground, competition for value. And states are much better set up for that. And let's deal with issues that are important for this institution, like national security, securing the border, having strong agriculture and have good interstate commerce. And I yield back.
Reclaiming my time. Wisconsin is one of 27 states that offer state-run meat inspection programs. And as of 2013, participants in the cooperative interstate shipment program was over the top. We're very supportive of our small meat processors in Wisconsin. I've got a handful of them that are within just miles of my home, and they do everything from beef to chicken to venison. We have a 9-day deer gun season, and there will be a line a mile away from the small meat processor trying to do everything from hot sticks to venison brats to summer sausage, right? So there's a culture there. The result is nearly 500 state, federal, and custom exempt meat processing facilities in Wisconsin that in 2018 processed more than 2.2 billion pounds of meat. I say this not only to highlight the important work of the processors in Wisconsin, but also to stress how impactful federal regs can be on the small processors as well, which you hear from all the time. So, Mr. Salatin, I thought I'd throw this to you. I know it's a big question, but because you have a history of helping small processors, do you see a difference in the way that they deal with the USDA requirements compared to obviously the big four, and if they have the capability of dealing with these very onerous USDA rules and regulations?
Yeah, the way to deal with them is quite different when you're big versus when you're small. I'll give you a personal story at our plant. We had our kill floor guy retired, and so the second guy moved up, first day on the job, first day for a brand new inspector. Remember, when you're a small plant, you get the newbies. And so we had a new inspector, a lady, and she'd been told, look, you're entering a man's world, you better make sure that so she'd been read the riot act by her superiors. She comes in first day on the job, new kill floor manager. Most of the inspectors, they kind of stand back and just kind of watch the kill floor, watch the room, then they're going to grab through the guts a little bit. And, but she was hovering right over the shoulder, okay, almost like playing piggyback with the guy. He was nervous, first day in charge of the kill floor. He misses the pig. If you've ever heard a missed pig with the captive bolt, if you ever heard a wounded pig, it's not fun. And so he's shaking, he puts the second thing in, hits it, and the pig goes down. She then goes in and writes us up for a felony-level animal abuse charge, closes the plant for a week. There's no appeal, there's no nothing. We finally got back open, so we couldn't pay our employees, we couldn't serve our customers, people didn't eat, All right, we get back open. The bottom line is that if our HACCP plan, where it says administer captive bolt in knock box and then slit throat, step B, if instead it had had A, administer captive bolt, B, if A misses, redo A, we would have been perfectly fine. But as Ms. Baumann said, we don't have the capability, we don't have the money to go to all the trade shows and the industry where the big guys sit around and play golf and drink and wine and dine each other, telling them how to game the system. So we didn't know about the option of B in the HACCP plan, re-administer A. So we get shut down for a week. This is the kind of prejudicial thing that happens to us small operators routinely. It happens with microbial checking, it happens with infrastructure requirements, it happens with these kinds of things. That is exactly the kind of thing that happens.
Thank you very much for that answer. I'll yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes myself for 5 minutes of questioning. One of the things that strikes me as I listen to your testimony today and the discussion that we've had is I often say that government is always trying to fix its last solution. The federal government, through misguided laws and regulations, has created the monopolistic problems that we've talked about, the agency capture that has been raised, the regulatory burdens that have been discussed, and now we need to fix this mess. And the Prime Act is an excellent step in that direction. Mr. Salatin, if under the Prime Act, farmers and ranchers are able to feed their livestock for a longer period of time because they're able to sell or contract with the independent processors that we've been talking about rather than a feedlot, do you think that there would be benefits to the consumers as well?
That's probably the most unsung story of the hearing today, is the benefits to the consumer. A, they wouldn't be subjected to only this oligarchical funnel. They would now have lots of options. So that creates a more resilient, secure food supply, a more stable food supply for shocks and, black swan events, all right? Number two, they would be able to buy small volumes instead of large volumes. So they wouldn't have to maintain either as large a freezer or as large a bank account. It would be a more democratic access to people that can't afford the large volumes. And number three, the price would come down because it doesn't have to be pushed through this very expensive capital and paperwork and regulatory intensive sieve of small plant federal inspection. And I would suggest finally that they would know more where their meat came from, and there would actually be more overall accountability within the system, from traceability, responsibility, all those kinds of things would happen because it is a smaller it's a more relational, intimate transaction rather than a nameless, faceless label on a supermarket shelf.
Well, I think that's a very good summary. And under the federal program and the federal laws and regulations that have set this up, in Wyoming we have 12 USDA meat processors and 10 state-inspected slaughter facilities. The meat that is processed under our state inspection can be bought and sold within the state, but not outside of the state. Mr. Trotter, is there any reason to believe that there is a lesser quality of meat or a less healthy meat or a less safe meat that is being produced in our state-regulated facilities?
I mean, the way the current law is set up, the state authorities, the state inspectors are held to exactly the same standards as their federal counterparts. The facilities themselves are also held to the same standards as the federal counterparts. So no, it's really up to the same standard. It is just a different agency going in and enforcing these standards. And the agency themselves are reviewed by FSIS and the USDA.
So it really comes down to just it's a different entity employing the inspector. Do you think that Congress should reform the Wholesale Meat Act?
I'm not sure I could comment quite as well as some of the other people here on that, but it's something definitely worth looking at.
Okay. Do you have any policy recommendations for the subcommittee today?
I would say that the subcommittee and Congress in general has the opportunity here to empower small businesses without actually detracting from any federal oversight. At this point, you can empower these small companies, the 1 or 2 person businesses that are throughout the nation, thousands of them, that are able and willing and ready to help empower the other small businesses, restaurants, grocers, and people in their local communities. And this is not something that necessarily should have federal inspection and federal just direct oversight day to day for very small parts of the market here. And there are ways, by essentially returning this power to the states, states can go ahead and set their own standards. And that is the purpose of state governments and just the concept of federalism as a whole.
You know, Mr. Salatin, you said something today that really resonated with me, and you used the word freedom. And that really is the foundation of our Constitution and our republic. I respect the fact and understand and appreciate your understanding of how freedom is related to the very topics that we're discussing today. All 4 of you have been wonderful witnesses. We appreciate the comments and the commentary that you have provided, the personal experiences that you have had, and why this is such an important issue, not just for you, not just for our small producers, and not just for one segment of our industries, This has to do with food supply. This has to do with the supply chain. This has to do with being able to provide affordable beef and pork and chicken and venison to the citizens of this great country. I just truly believe that one of the things that our government should be doing is we need to make sure that we are adopting policies and regulations and laws that do not increase the cost of food, housing, and energy. And your contribution today allows us to address one of those very important legs to that three-legged stool, and I appreciate it. With that, I believe that that concludes today's hearing, and we thank you again for appearing before the committee today.
If I might, Madam
Without
Chair.
all, what is it?
I'd just like to make a closing comment.
I think that we're just going to go ahead and finish the hearing.
Well, the chair took liberty to do a second round of questioning, did she not?
Oh, no, I didn't. That was my first round of questioning. I had Matt Gates's, he yielded his time to me.
Well,
So I
with
did not.
With a closing
So with
statement
that-
having been rendered by the chair, I would think
With
a
that-
closing statement by the ranking member would be appropriate.
Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days to submit additional written questions for the witnesses or additional materials for the record. So, Mr. Johnson, you have the ability to do that. And without objection, this hearing is adjourned.